Thank you, and good morning. So as you may have heard, I am in the business of bias, which fundamentally is solving the challenge that people have of seeing people, particularly when they're not represented in a domain. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. I was born in Southeast Washington, D.C., to a single mom who at one point was homeless while pregnant with me, later battled a drug addiction, but as fate would have it, she moved to Washington, D.C. to live with her sister, who was a computer scientist in 1984, when about a third of all CS degrees went to women. So I started coding at 13, became a full-stack developer, took AP Computer Science, and was fortunate to graduate from Stanford with an engineering degree and technical internships at Fortune 500 companies, such that Microsoft hired me. Here's my little team lunch. Stayed there for 5 years, realized that it had very limited growth potential, so quit to go to a little school in Cambridge called MIT. Graduated from MIT with an MBA, and about 6 months later, interviewed for an analytical lead role at Google here in New York. Made it to the final rounds, thought it went really well. The recruiter came back and said, sorry, we don't think you're quite technical enough, but we're gonna hang on to your resume in case a more sales or marketing position opens up. I politely declined, but later found out that Google, and along with a lot of other tech companies, were about 30% female and 2% African American. And the common narrative was, it was a pipeline problem. I believe that the minority of Asian Americans creates this sort of idea that we are diverse, we don't have a problem, we just need more women and underrepresented minorities to get the degrees that we're hiring for. So I want to explore the pipeline problem a bit more. So more than half of the US population are women, soon to be underrepresented minorities, and other industries don't seem to have as much of a challenge as hiring women and Black and Latinx candidates. But furthermore, for the first time in history, women are twice as likely as men to earn college degrees, and by 2040, the majority of college graduates will be non-white. So there has to be more to the story than just the pipeline problem, and I believe that is cognitive bias. We see that in resume reviews, where the National Bureau of Economic Research did a study. They sent out 2 identical resumes, just changed the name from Emily to Greg or Emily to Lakeisha, and received a 2x difference in response rate. And so we know that bias is prevalent all throughout people operations, which is why, despite Google's assessment, I took my non-technical self and built Blendoor, which started as an app but has evolved into a full enterprise software platform focused on anonymizing resumes, but also tracking the outcomes of the demographics of candidates throughout the entire hiring funnel to be able to identify where and how bias exists in these processes. We've gotten some pretty great recognition from the press. Thanks, guys. And we're growing about 150% year over year. Google is now a client. But now we're hitting another brick wall of bias in the venture capital industry, where, as we know, about 3% of women are getting venture capital in the US, but 0.006% of Black women are getting venture capital. I am actually one of only 40 Black women in the world ever to raise over $1 million in venture capital. So huge problem. And bias is everywhere. So here's a chart about cognitive bias, fundamentally talking about what are the elements for why our brain results in shortcuts, particularly when we're evaluating people that aren't in our networks. And I would say the biggest I've noticed in my time in Silicon Valley is the need to act fast, right? That's the mantra. Build fast and break things. But what happens when you're breaking people? And I think that's what we're realizing now as we enter into the people analytics domain, where algorithms are predicting the outcomes of people's trajectories. How are we ensuring that they're fair? And the most obvious case of this is with facial recognition software. So this was a study done a couple years ago by the Algorithmic Justice League, which showed that the accuracy of facial recognition software declines as your face is more feminine and browner. So the biggest gap, of course, is between white men and Black women. So what does that mean in real life? Well, it means, despite the fact that I pay the exact same price for my phone and my laptop, I can't unlock my device. It doesn't recognize me. Minor inconvenience, right? But what about when autonomous vehicles are responsible for identifying me in the crosswalk, or cameras are being used that can falsely identify me as having committed a crime? So then algorithmic bias enters the domain of becoming potentially fatal for people that look like me. So a really good book on this is by Dr. Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, if you want to understand exactly the ways AI and big data are threatening a lot of social domains. Now, I am not a Luddite. I have gone to the top schools for technology, obviously. I've lived in Silicon Valley the majority of my adult life. I firmly believe that AI and machine learning can solve a lot of the blind spots that we have, but it has to be done right. And how? Well, better data that represents the entire human population in order to drive machine learning algorithms that are transparent. So removing the black box so we can understand the methodologies that are going into the algorithms deciding our trajectories and being built by diverse teams. And these are the cornerstones of a product that we actually released a couple years ago called BlendScore, which is a comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion rating and ranking of America's top 200 tech companies. We basically factor in all sorts of information from the percentage of women and underrepresented minorities on your board to your overall US workforce diversity, but also what benefits, programs, partnerships, initiatives do you have in place focused on equity, inclusion, and belonging in your company. Why are we doing this? ESG. So now we're in a different ballgame, right? Because analysts realize that your company's profitability and sustainability are correlated to the diversity health of your company, particularly as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, where diverse knowledge workers are going to be essential to your ability to build technologies in ubiquitous computing, in job automation, et cetera, that impact the entire world. So we're starting to have conversations around how and why we can enable companies to be a lot more strategic around this, in that it's not a nice to have, it is a need to have. So many of us are here because we revere the big tech companies that have impacted millions and billions of people around the world. Maybe everyone but Kara. I know I heard her voice somewhere. Fundamentally, what we know is that as we increase access to education and there's increased cultural cross-pollination, we will be in a realm where this image will no longer be representative of the geniuses building technology that change the quality of life. And my thesis is those individuals, institutions, and companies that recognize and capitalize on that will have a competitive advantage. And I was actually invited 4 years ago to the first ever White House Demo Day, which was blocks away from where my mother was almost arrested for purchasing drugs. And the president said something really interesting.
Next Steve Jobs might be named Stephanie.
Next Steve Jobs might be named Stephanie.
It was great. Thank you so much for the time.